March 1933. The air in America was thick with panic. Banks were shuttered. Lines of desperate citizens snaked through empty streets, clutching their savings like fragile lifelines. And then, with the stroke of a pen, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102. Overnight, gold, the symbol of trust, of independence, of generational wealth, became illegal. To possess it was a crime. To protect it, a sin. Imagine holding your wealth in your hands, the tangible weight of gold coins, bars stacked like promises. And suddenly, the government demanded you surrender it or face jail. Families who had saved through decades, small business owners who had stashed gold as insurance against uncertain times, all confronted the same terrifying reality. The very foundation of their security was now outlawed. The system they believed would protect them had turned into a predator. Fear, confusion, and betrayal flooded every city, every town. The newspapers screamed warnings. Banks posted notices. Federal agents descended, knocking on doors, inspecting safes, confiscating gold from homes and businesses alike. There was no time to question, no room to negotiate. The countdown had begun. Citizens were caught between obedience and survival. Those who resisted were branded criminals. Those who complied, victims of an invisible expropriation. The fabric of trust between people and between the people and their government was ripped apart in days. This wasn't mere economic policy. It was a seismic reordering of power. Gold had always represented more than money. It was autonomy, a hedge against collapse, a tangible measure of one's place in the world. And now, that autonomy was gone. Overnight, the nation's wealth was no longer private. The invisible hand of the state reached into homes, vaults, and wallets, rewriting the rules. Families whispered in fear, business owners panicked, and the elite watched silently as fear became the currency of obedience. For historians, this moment was a prelude to control. For citizens living through it, it was a horror movie written in real life. People lined up at banks, surrendering their coins, their bars, their inheritance. Gold melted down into Federal Reserve coffers. The streets buzzed with rumors. Who had hidden gold? Who would be punished? Who had already complied? Trust evaporated faster than the paper notes that would now replace the metallic standard. It wasn't just the theft that stunned people. It was the inevitability. Roosevelt presented it as necessary, a life raft for a sinking economy. But beneath the official justification lay a harsher truth. The financial system itself was unstable, and someone had to bear the cost. The citizens, everyday Americans, became the scapegoats of a crisis engineered by debt, speculation, and institutional mismanagement. Gold, once untouchable, was now a liability. And in that vacuum, fear became absolute. By the end of March, millions of dollars worth of gold had vanished into government hands. Citizens returned home empty-handed, bewildered, trapped in a system that promised stability but delivered only uncertainty. That was the day wealth died. Not because it ceased to exist, but because the rules of ownership had been rewritten without consent. And once the precedent was set, the message was clear. When the system falters, your wealth is never safe, especially when it is tangible, portable, undeniable. The stage was set, panic had taken hold, and the machinery of control was rolling. The nation had entered a new reality, one where fear would define obedience, and gold, the symbol of trust and freedom, had become a weapon turned against its holders. History has a rhythm, a pattern that repeats with relentless precision. Civilizations rise, empires flourish, wealth accumulates, and then, just before the fall, the powerful reach for the gold. Rome, the eternal empire, confiscated its citizens' bullion to fund endless wars. England, flush with empire, levied extraordinary taxes and seized precious metals to maintain its global dominance. And now, in 1933, America had followed the same inexorable script. Look at Rome. By the 3rd century, inflation had eroded trust in coinage. Citizens hoarded gold as the only reliable measure of value. The emperors, desperate to maintain armies and quell dissent, decreed confiscations. People who had lived their lives building fortunes from labor and inheritance suddenly faced the same terrifying reality. Their wealth could be declared illegal at any moment. The pattern was clear. When the elite's power is threatened, when the system's survival depends on it, individual wealth is the first casualty. Across centuries, the story repeats. In medieval Europe, kings demanded gold from nobles under threat of imprisonment, even death. In colonial empires, treasure fleets carried plundered gold from distant lands straight into royal coffers. Gold was not just currency, it was leverage, control, and an unspoken weapon. And while the methods evolved, from swords and decrees to legislation and executive orders, the principle remained. Whoever controls gold controls loyalty, survival, and the narrative of power. By 1933, Americans thought themselves immune. They lived in a democracy, in a nation founded on liberty and property rights. But the global lessons of history were not erased. The crash of 1929 exposed the fragility of banks, the volatility of debt, and the fragility of confidence. Just as empires of old had reacted to crisis with forceful expropriation, the Roosevelt administration did what centuries of rulers had done before. It asserted control over gold. Citizens who had once trusted that private wealth was sacred discovered, shockingly, that history had returned with a vengeance. And it wasn't random. Patterns like these are always intentional. The confiscation of gold serves multiple purposes. It fills the coffers of a struggling state, it centralizes financial power, and it erodes the independence of citizens. Those who had hoarded gold for security, for freedom, for autonomy, were now dependent on the very system that had taken it. Fear replaced confidence. Compliance became survival. The lesson of Rome, of England, of every empire teetering on collapse was written in the lives of Americans overnight. Notice the subtlety. No empire announces its fall outright. It whispers. It pressures. It coaxes obedience under the guise of necessity. Citizens accept small intrusions at first, then larger ones, until the hand of power has claimed what was once untouchable. By outlawing gold, the government didn't merely redistribute wealth. It reshaped the psychological contract between the state and the individual. Wealth was no longer private. Autonomy was no longer guaranteed. History had given its warning, but Americans had not recognized the pattern until the law was enacted. What emerges is terrifyingly simple. When money becomes a weapon, when debt and crisis threaten the elite, the public is always the target. And gold, the oldest, most trusted store of value, always becomes the first battlefield. 1933 was not an anomaly. It was the latest iteration of a method that had endured millennia. For those who understood history, the writing was on the wall. For the rest, it was a sudden, brutal awakening to a truth older than any constitution. Empires do not fall quietly. And when they fight for survival, your wealth is never safe. History is a mirror, and 1933 was the reflection staring back at America. The past is always watching, waiting to repeat itself, and the pattern of expropriation is inevitable. Look closely at 1933, and it begins to feel eerily familiar. The fear, the panic, the sudden intrusion of government into personal wealth, all of it echoes through time, whispering warnings we refuse to hear. Today, the same mechanisms are at work, only the forms have changed. Cash is being replaced by digital ledgers. Gold may no longer be the primary target, but control over money, over what you can spend and where you can store value, is more absolute than ever. Consider the modern financial landscape. Central banks printing money at unprecedented rates, national debts swelling to record highs, inflation quietly eroding purchasing power. Citizens watch as interest rates fluctuate, as the value of their savings dwindles, while those at the helm, bankers, policymakers, elites, manipulate the system to protect their own fortunes. The parallels are undeniable. Fear is the tool, dependency is the strategy, and control is the ultimate objective. In 1933, the government demanded citizens hand over their gold. Today, the intrusion is subtler, but no less powerful. Central bank digital currencies, negative interest rates, capital controls, tools designed to monitor, restrict, and, when convenient, confiscate. The same principle applies. The system prioritizes its survival over your autonomy. Just as Americans once queued outside banks clutching gold, modern citizens are increasingly reliant on digital wallets, credit systems, and intermediaries that can dictate access to wealth at the flick of a switch. History also teaches another lesson. Crises are catalysts. The Great Depression allowed Roosevelt to enact his gold confiscation. In our era, crises, whether financial, environmental, or geopolitical, serve a similar function. Emergency powers, bailouts, regulatory overreach, and new forms of monetary control are framed as solutions, yet they systematically reduce the freedom of individuals while consolidating power in the hands of a few. It is the same pattern, dressed in modern attire. Fear remains the lever. Compliance remains the price. Look at public perception. In 1933, citizens were told gold confiscation was necessary to save the economy. Today, narratives around inflation, economic stability, or protection against financial collapse serve the same function. They condition the populace to accept interventions that, under normal circumstances, would seem outrageous. The lesson is clear. The public will tolerate a gradual erosion of autonomy when fear is manufactured effectively, and when historical memory has faded. The chilling truth is that the mechanisms of control have only grown more sophisticated. Whereas gold bars could be counted, hidden, and surrendered under duress, modern assets exist in digital forms, easily monitored and manipulated. Governments and financial institutions can freeze accounts, track transactions, and impose limits with a keystroke. Wealth, once tangible and untraceable, is becoming as fluid and vulnerable as it has ever been. The parallels are not metaphorical. They are real, structural, and immediate. And yet, most people fail to see it. They believe that the past is irrelevant, that history's lessons are abstract. But 1933 is not a distant memory. It is a template. Fear, dependency, and systemic control have only evolved. They have not disappeared. The parallels are undeniable. A fragile financial system, a panicked populace, and an elite ready to exploit both. Once again, the public stands at the crossroads of autonomy and submission, witnessing the same playbook unfold under a new name. If you understand this, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. History is not behind us. It is repeating, reshaped but unmistakable. And just as Americans once faced the sudden criminalization of gold, today we face the slow, invisible erosion of financial freedom. The warning signs are there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to see the parallels before it's too late. Every crisis has its winners. Every act of confiscation, every emergency decree, every financial panic carries an invisible hand guiding the spoils. In 1933, when Americans were forced to surrender their gold, it was not just the government that benefited. It was the elite, the banks, and the architects of a financial system that had engineered the collapse in the first place. While citizens lost their autonomy, these hidden beneficiaries secured wealth, influence, and control that would last generations. Consider the Federal Reserve. Established in 1913, it was designed to manage currency, stabilize markets, and ostensibly protect the public. But in practice, it had become a mechanism of power for a select few. When the gold confiscation occurred, the Fed gained unprecedented leverage. Gold that had once belonged to private citizens now flowed into its vaults. It wasn't charity, it was control. With that gold, the Federal Reserve could back new currency, dictate interest rates, and reshape the economy on terms favorable to itself and its partners. The invisible elite had their insurance policy. Then there were the banks. Local, regional, and national institutions had already been flirting with collapse during the Depression. By mandating the surrender of gold, the government effectively forced citizens to recapitalize the banking system. The wealth of the people, the tangible asset they had trusted, became the lifeblood of institutions that had mismanaged risk and speculation. Ordinary Americans bore the cost of financial miscalculations, while the banks emerged stronger, protected by the very policies that stripped citizens of their assets. And let's not forget the networks of political and financial elites operating behind the scenes. Families, trusts, and organizations who had influence over legislation, economic policy, and monetary decisions quietly profited from the chaos. While the public suffered, these groups leveraged insider knowledge, access to policy, and foresight to position themselves advantageously. Crisis, in this view, was not a failure, it was an opportunity. And history shows us this pattern repeating, over and over, wherever concentrated power meets systemic vulnerability. The betrayal is multi-layered. Roosevelt presented the gold confiscation as a patriotic duty, a necessary step to stabilize the economy. Citizens complied, believing in the promise of security and recovery. But while they sacrificed, the machinery of power quietly shifted in favor of the few. Wealth was consolidated, influence strengthened, and the architecture of control solidified. The true beneficiaries were never visible on the front lines. They operated in the shadows, ensuring that fear translated into obedience, and obedience into profit. This is not just history. It is a lens for understanding the present. The same structures exist today, though more complex and technologically sophisticated. Banks, central authorities, and global financial networks remain poised to exploit crises, while the average citizen assumes the risk. Data, digital currency, and surveillance now replace gold bars, but the principle is unchanged. When panic strikes, the hidden beneficiaries reap the rewards, while the public pays the price. Understanding who benefits changes everything. It shifts fear into clarity. It turns confusion into comprehension. And it exposes a truth that governments and institutions prefer to obscure. The system is not neutral. It never was. Crises are manufactured, amplified, or exploited to redistribute power upward. The gold confiscation of 1933 was a lesson in betrayal, a warning etched in history for anyone willing to recognize the players behind the curtain. Look closely, and the pattern emerges. Every collapse, every panic, every emergency decree is rarely about the survival of the system. It is about the enrichment of those who control it. The lesson is stark, unavoidable, and chilling. The hidden beneficiaries are always watching, always waiting, always ready to turn fear into profit and chaos into power. History does not repeat, it evolves. The confiscation of gold in 1933 was a blunt, visible act. Citizens lined up, surrendered their bars and coins, and the transaction was tangible. Today, the mechanisms of control are subtler, invisible, and far more powerful. The next confiscation may not target gold at all. It will target what we rely on most: digital assets, data, and the very means by which we access, store, and transfer wealth. The blueprint is already emerging. Central bank digital currencies, negative interest rates, cashless systems, and account monitoring are not just conveniences, they are levers of control. Governments can now track, limit, and even freeze financial activity with a keystroke. Unlike physical gold, which could be hidden or buried, digital wealth exists in a networked system entirely under oversight. The lesson of 1933 warns us that when the state or elite sees risk to its power, they will act. And now, the tools are far more efficient. The inevitability lies in patterns of dependence. Debt-driven economies, financialization, and complex monetary networks create vulnerabilities. When the system faces stress, fear becomes the instrument to enforce compliance. Citizens may not be told to hand over gold, but they may be forced to accept limits, restrictions, or policies that strip autonomy without even realizing it. Wealth, freedom, and privacy can be eroded incrementally, and by the time the public notices, the shift has become permanent. Yet within this inevitability lies a paradox. Knowledge is power. Those who understand history, who recognize the cycles, gain a form of immunity. Awareness allows preparation, adaptation, and resistance. Just as gold was once a refuge, today's savvy individuals explore alternative stores of value, decentralized systems, and self-sovereign financial strategies. The story of 1933 teaches that compliance is not mandatory, but ignorance is costly. Recognizing the pattern offers a chance to reclaim agency, even in the face of overwhelming systemic power. The broader warning is clear. Crises are opportunities for both the powerful and the vigilant. Wealth and freedom are never guaranteed. They are contingent on awareness, strategy, and foresight. When history shows us the recurring cycle, panic, confiscation, consolidation of power, the question is not whether it will happen again, but how prepared we are to respond. The clock is always ticking. The machinery of control never rests. The next crisis may be digital, it may be invisible, but it will follow the same logic. Fear compels obedience, and obedience consolidates power. Still, hope persists. The human spirit has always found ways to adapt. Decentralized networks, encrypted wealth, and alternative economies offer paths outside the control of a single institution. Awareness itself is revolutionary. Understanding the past, seeing the parallels, and anticipating the future grants a form of freedom that gold alone could never provide. While systems of power are relentless, they are not omnipotent. Knowledge, vigilance, and resilience remain humanity's greatest safeguards. The inevitability is terrifying, but it is not absolute. History's cycles teach caution, but they also offer guidance. Gold may have been seized in 1933, but the principles of autonomy, foresight, and resistance endure. In a world where control has become invisible and subtle, the question is whether we will recognize the signs before it is too late. The echoes of the past are clear. The system will push, fear will rise, and power will consolidate. But those who understand the pattern have a chance to survive, adapt, and even thrive. The next confiscation may be silent, digital, and undetectable. But one thing remains timeless: the human capacity to recognize, resist, and reclaim what is rightfully ours. History warns, and history empowers. The choice is ours: awareness or obedience, vigilance or compliance, freedom or submission. The question is, which path will we take?